Have you ever stopped to think about what it means to spend your whole life looking at someone and saying, that's the guy I want to surpass? Not out of hatred, not out of envy, but with a flame burning inside your chest that never goes out. One that only grows stronger every time you hear that person's name. Luffy has done that his entire life with Shanks, and now in the Elbaf arc, the story Oda's been building for over 25 years is reaching a point that will change everything you thought you knew about that relationship. But here's the question nobody's asking right. Is the battle between Shanks and Luffy actually going to happen? And if it does, why? What is Oda really building toward? Because there's a theory circulating among manga readers that makes more sense than anything you've read on this topic. And when you finish hearing this, you're going to reread the entire story with brand new eyes. Let's start from the beginning, because Elbaf didn't come out of nowhere. Since the Little Garden arc, way back in the early days of the series, Luffy and Usopp dreamed about visiting the land of the giants. Dory and Broggy, the two warriors who spent 100 years beating each other on an isolated island over a ridiculous argument about the size of a fish, already carried within them the entire essence of what Elbaf represents. Honor above all else, pride until death, and the culture that doesn't yield even before God himself. When the Straw Hats finally arrive at this legendary island starting in chapter 1126 of the manga, you feel the ground shift beneath your feet. This isn't Egghead anymore. This isn't Wano. This is Elbaf, and Elbaf is different. The island welcomes the Straw Hats with open arms through Dory and Broggy, who throw an enormous feast in their honor. Luffy's completely enchanted, Usopp's on the verge of tears, and you, watching all of this unfold, feel that warm rush of knowing that 2 decades of waiting were worth every second. But the peace doesn't last long, because while the Straw Hats explore the Walrus School and the Owl Library, a figure appears in the underworld of Elbaf that freezes the blood of every reader. A man with a face identical to Shanks, but with long hair, noble garments, and an aura that screams world government. Figureland Shamrock, Shanks' twin brother. Yes, Shanks has a twin brother, and that detail didn't come out of nowhere. Oda planted it all the way back in 2018 in chapter 907 during the Reverie, where a figure similar to Shanks was seen speaking with the Gorosei. At the time, the entire fandom panicked, thinking Shanks was working for the world government. But something was off. Shanks' trademark scar wasn't on his face, the arm detail was missing, and the expression on that figure's face was far too cold to belong to the same man who wept at Marineford. Now, with chapter 1137, Oda finally delivers the answer. It wasn't Shanks, it was Shamrock, leader of the Holy Knights, son of Garling Figarland, now promoted to the rank of the Gorosei, following Saturn's death, an antagonist built in the shadows for nearly 7 years. Take a deep breath, because this revelation changes the entire board. Think about this for a second. If Shanks has a twin brother who leads the Holy Knights, it means Shanks' origins as a world noble aren't just a curious footnote from the past. It's a ticking time bomb about to detonate inside the narrative. And this is where the theory that makes the most sense within what Oda is building comes in. Shanks was born the son of Garling Figarland, a world noble and the god's knight. But when he was just 1 year old, he was found inside a treasure chest by the Roger Pirates during the God Valley incident. Nobody knows exactly how he ended up there. And that's not Oda being careless. That's a deliberate question. A massive gap he's been filling in piece by piece, especially now that the Elbaf arc is revealing the events of the God Valley incident in detail, with chapter 1160 entirely dedicated to it. And what readers are discovering is that this event was far more complex than the simple Roger and Garp defeated Rocksteady Zebek version we were told. There were layers, there were impossible moral choices, and apparently, Shanks came out of that event in a way we still don't fully understand. Now, back to Elbaf. Loki, the cursed prince of the giants, is crucified for killing King Harold, and the one who captured him and handed him over to the giants was Shanks. That's in chapter 1139. Shanks was the only one capable of defeating Loki after he fled Elbaf after the king's death, and it was precisely that achievement that earned him his Emperor of the Sea title. But here's the detail that sparks the theory. Shanks isn't just a powerful pirate, he's a guardian. There's a well-established theory within the manga community that proposes the following. Shanks is consciously positioning himself as the final obstacle between Luffy and the One Piece, not because he's a villain, but because he wants to test whether Luffy truly deserves to be king of the pirates. The most cited piece of evidence is the scene in chapter 1058, where it's revealed that Shanks seriously considered confronting the Straw Hats to reclaim the Straw Hat before Luffy was strong enough. But he held back because he saw that Luffy had grown enough. That's not the behavior of an enemy. That's the behavior of a mentor who's still measuring his student. And now, in the Elbaf arc, with the road poneglyph in the hands of Gabon, Roger's a former left-hand man who appeared in chapter 1130 living as a hermit on the island, the poneglyph question becomes absolutely central. Luffy needs the last road poneglyph to reach Laugh Tale, and if Shanks has access to that poneglyph, whether directly or through his connection to Gabon, then the meeting between the two becomes inevitable, not as allies, but as two forces that need to measure each other before either one can move forward.
Put yourself in this situation for a moment. You've spent your entire life admiring someone. You copied their style, embraced their straw hat, promised to return it only when you were worthy. And now you're standing in the same world as that person, stronger than you've ever been, with your crew by your side. And the only thing standing between you and your dream is a confrontation with the man who inspired you to be who you are. How does that feel? That's exactly why the battle between Luffy and Shanks, if it happens, won't simply be a clash of power. It will be a declaration. It will be Luffy saying, "I made it this far. I am who you hoped I'd become." But the smartest theory isn't that they'll fight in Elbaf. In fact, the most compelling arguments point in a different direction. The real showdown between Luffy and Shanks will most likely happen on Lodestar Island. Why? Because Lodestar is the second to last island on the Grand Line, the island where every path converges before Laugh Tale. It's the perfect narrative location. It would be where Shanks places his final test. It would be where Luffy returns the Straw Hat with his own hands, eye to eye, as an equal, and no longer as someone looking up. But before that, Elbaf is delivering something no theory managed to fully predict, the revelation that Elbaf belongs to the D-Clan. That's in chapter 1171, when Emu, in a conversation with the Five Elders, literally states that Elbaf is D, a vague, heavy statement packed with implications. What does it mean? It means the Giants, or the island itself as a nation, were aligned with Joy Boy during the Void Century, just as the D-Clan has always stood in opposition to the world government. And that positions Elbaf not merely as an island of warriors, but as a historical stronghold of resistance against tyranny. And this is where the theory about Shanks versus Luffy takes on an entirely new dimension. If Elbaf is D, and Shanks grew up in a wine-producing town in the West Blue, far from the Figureland family, yet spent years connected to Elbaf as his territory, then what Shanks is protecting isn't just a piece of land. He's protecting a legacy of the D-Clan, a legacy that includes Elbaf's freedom, Loki's fate, and now Luffy's own future as the potential king of the pirates. Shanks knowing all of this, using that knowledge to calculate precisely when and how to step aside for Luffy, isn't manipulation, it's respect. It's the most powerful form of love a mentor can show. Prepare the ground, hold the door open, then place yourself on the other side of it, waiting for the student to be strong enough to walk through. Now we've arrived at the core of everything. The theory that makes sense isn't that Shanks will be a villain. It's not that Shanks will betray Luffy. The theory that makes sense is the simplest one and the most emotionally devastating. Shanks will be Luffy's final test before Laugh Tale, a test that Shanks consciously chose to become. And the outcome of that clash, when it comes, will matter far more for what the moment represents than for who wins on a technical level. Because Luffy doesn't need to defeat Shanks to become king of the pirates. He needs to surpass Shanks, surpass what he represents, the kind of admiration that can paralyze you, the fear of never being good enough, the enormous shadow of a man who gave his arm for a kid who could barely swim. And on the day Luffy looks at Shanks with that ridiculous grin of his, and Shanks answers with that same smile, like in the flashback at the very beginning, you'll know that moment isn't a defeat for either of them. It's a shared victory. Look at what the Elbaf arc is building. Loki is introduced as the strongest giant in history, and it was Shanks who defeated him. Luffy is now standing side by side with Loki, facing Emu himself. Luffy's growth is being measured against the benchmark Shanks set. Every step Luffy takes in Elbaf is one more rung on the ladder, bringing him closer not just to the One Piece, but to being worthy of the encounter that will change his life forever. And Shamrock? Shanks' twin brother, the leader of the Holy Knights, the product of the nobility Shanks chose to abandon. He represents what Shanks could have become if he'd stayed. Power without freedom, a title without purpose. He is the living embodiment of the path Shanks rejected, and confronting him through Luffy's fight is one more way Oda is saying that the world the Holy Knights protect has no room for the true dream Shanks has always carried in his chest. With the manga's most recent chapters showing Luffy and Loki side by side facing Emu, battles unfolding on multiple fronts, and Elbaf's destiny hanging in balance, it's clear that Oda is building towards an epic climax. And when that climax resolves, the next inevitable step will be the road to the meeting between Luffy and Shanks, a meeting that was promised in Chapter 1 of this story, a meeting that will demand everything Luffy has. A meeting where for the very first time, Luffy will be able to look Shanks in the eyes as an equal. But before that, one last question lingers in the air. If Shanks is truly waiting for the right moment to test Luffy, does he already know Luffy is ready? Or is there still something he needs to witness happen in Elbaf before he takes that final step?